They expected another disaster. Another futile charge into the storm. Another slaughter. Another step closer to collapse. But what came was revolution, in every sense of the word. In the summer of 1916, as the fields of Verdun reeked with blood and steel, a forgotten front in the east stirred with new life. And from that front came a man, a general, who refused to fight by the book. Alexei Brusilov, a name barely remembered in the West. But for a brief, brilliant moment, he shattered the myth of Russian incompetence and came closer to toppling Austria-Hungary than any general before him. But at what cost? Was the Brusilov Offensive a triumph of reform or the last gasp of an empire already rotting from within? This is the story of the most successful and most tragic offensive of the Eastern Front, and the man who dared to change everything. By early 1916, the Eastern Front had settled into a strange stillness. Not the deadly rigidity of the trenches in France, but a vast, shifting landscape of blood and exhaustion. The Great Retreat of 1915 had left Russian morale shattered, Galicia lost, Poland abandoned, millions displaced. But unlike the West, the East still allowed for movement the kind that tempts both dreams and delusions. The Russians still had the numbers. What they lacked was faith. In March, they had tried to rekindle hope at Lake Narok. 78,000 Russian casualties. 10 days. No gain. The Germans barely flinched. It was a humiliation. And worse, it had been ordered not for Russia's own aims, but at the request of the French, to distract the Germans at Verdun, to bleed for an ally. And in that moment, many Russian generals began to see their sacrifices as senseless. Among them, Alexei Evert and Alexei Kuropatkin, commanders of the Western and Northern fronts. They had fought. They had bled. And now, they wanted no more. Better to dig deep, to wait, to gather artillery, to let time and Germany's other enemies do the work. But waiting was not an option. At the Allied Conference in Chantilly, December 1915, all the Entente powers made a pact. When one is attacked, the others strike. No exceptions. A coordinated effort to shatter the Central Powers. Russia had no choice. Chief of Staff Mikhail Alexeyev ordered new offensives to begin in the summer. Despite hesitation, despite a lack of artillery, despite everything, and in this moment of uncertainty, one general stepped forward. Alexei Brusilov, commander of the Southwestern Front. Unconventional, detail-oriented, unshackled from the old guard's defeatism. Where others saw futility, Brusilov saw opportunity. Brusilov was not the image of the brutal, indifferent Tsarist general. He believed in preparation, in professionalism. He promoted officers for merit, not bloodline, a quiet rebellion in an army of aristocrats. And he had learned not just from Russia's mistakes, but from the tactics of France, of Britain, and even of Germany. He proposed a radical plan, rather than concentrate on a narrow breakthrough. As Russian doctrine demanded, he would attack on a wide front, 450 kilometers, dozens of potential breakthroughs, no single point of failure. The Austro-Hungarians would never see it coming, because they would not know where to look. Each sector would prepare its own assault, personally scouted and selected by local commanders. The troops would train with precision, even rehearsing in model trenches. Artillery would be guided by aerial reconnaissance, unheard of on the Eastern Front. Even the trenches themselves would change. Russian sappers dug sap trenches into no man's land, just 60 meters from the enemy line. From these hidden paths, soldiers would emerge almost upon the enemy doorstep. But it was not just tactics. Brusilov's men were to be trained differently. They would fight in 4 waves. First and second, grenadiers to clear trenches. Third, machine gunners to consolidate. Fourth, cavalry to exploit the breach. The goal? Not just to push the line, but to destroy enemy units outright, to shatter morale, to make resistance impossible. Some within the Russian high command mocked him, even warned him. One general whispered, "You have just been appointed commander. Don't risk your reputation. You will only do yourself harm." Brusilov disagreed, and he moved forward. On the other side of the front, the Austro-Hungarians slept in their trenches. Literally, in some cases. Their chief of staff, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, believed Russian attacks could not succeed. The debacle at Lake Narok had fed their arrogance. He issued reports praising defensive positions, boasting of reinforced trenches, heavy mortars, and overlapping fire. He emphasized strength in the first line, machine guns, ammunition, but he missed something crucial. Too many men in the first trench, too few reserves, and too little mobility. Behind the front line, many Austrian bunkers were built for comfort, not survival. Wood floors, painted walls, glass windows. This was not the mindset of an army bracing for catastrophe. Worse, the Austrians ignored intelligence. They dismissed signs of Russian buildup, intercepted communications, fresh saps in no man's land. They believed they had time, but Brusilov would give them none. At 4 o'clock in the morning, on the 4th of June, 1916, the sky over Galicia cracked open with thunder. But it was not the weather. It was the Russian guns. From the Carpathians to the Pripyat marshes, hundreds of batteries opened fire on the Austro-Hungarian lines. The shelling was not intense, not yet, but it was deliberate, measured, calculated. The defenders waited. And then, nothing. The barrage lifted. The Austrians rushed to their firing steps, ready for the charge. But no charge came, only scattered groups. Observers, spotters, men crawling forward, calling down adjusted fire. Then another barrage, then silence. Then again. This rhythm, this deliberate confusion, began to sap morale. By midday, some Austro-Hungarian soldiers refused to even leave their bunkers. And then came the Russians. At dusk, on that same day, the first true waves of infantry emerged from their hidden sap trenches, often just 50 meters from the enemy's line. They moved swiftly, quietly, and caught the Austrians still underground. The result was chaos. Entire trench lines collapsed within minutes. Machine gun crews were overrun before their weapons could be turned. Austrian officers found themselves trapped in cellars, surrounded, confused, disarmed. One prisoner recalled the moment. In the 6th second, perhaps a spirited defender cried, "To the trenches!" In the 7th second, he ran into someone on the stairwell. And in the 8th second, a voice from above called down to the men in the cellar that they should give themselves up. Machine guns already stood in front of every entrance to the caves. The trenches had been taken. By nightfall on the 6th of June, the Russians had taken 40,000 prisoners. The city of Lutsk, the key target of Brusilov's 8th Army, was already in sight. The Austro-Hungarian command panicked. Archduke Joseph Ferdinand, commander of the 4th Army, received dozens of requests to withdraw. But he delayed, hesitated, equivocated. By the time he issued orders, many of his units had already fled. Others who had not even been attacked withdrew anyway, fearing encirclement. The fallback positions, especially the Lutsk bridgehead, were in disrepair. No reinforcements, no supplies, no artillery. Brusilov's troops pressed on, and within days, the Austrians were forced across the Styr River, but not fast enough. As they tried to blow the bridges to delay pursuit, 59,000 men were still trapped on the wrong side. On the 7th of June, Lutsk fell. By mid-June, Brusilov's armies had carved a 60-kilometer deep salient into the Austro-Hungarian line. In the south, Czernowitz fell on the 18th opening the Carpathian passes into Hungary. It was not just a victory. It was a rupture. One Austrian army, Ferdinand's, had been reduced from 117,800 men to just 35,000 in 4 days. But there was more. 54% of Austria, Hungary's eastern forces, had been lost. Prisoners, wounded, dead, or fleeing. Brusilov had done what most thought impossible. He had broken the Austrians utterly. But even as Brusilov advanced, the plan around him crumbled. General Everett, who was supposed to launch a simultaneous assault on the Western Front against German positions, stalled. He cited bad weather, lack of shells, a strong German presence. The Tsar demanded movement. He granted a delay until the 18th of June, then the 3rd of July. Still, nothing. Rumors spread that Everett feared being upstaged. If Brusilov's diversion was already a triumph, what would a failed attack in the north do to his career? So he waited, and Brusilov, furious, was left to carry the war alone. The Tsar shifted priorities. More reinforcements, more supplies, all to Brusilov. But the window was closing. The Germans, alarmed by the collapse of their ally, began transferring units from the west. 30 divisions would move east to bolster the Austrians. Soon, they brought with them new commanders. New guns, new discipline. The advantage of surprise was gone. And Brusilov, who had planned a fast, devastating strike, now faced the burden of a full-scale war of attrition. By late June, Brusilov realized the nature of the offensive had changed. What was meant to be a short, destructive campaign to weaken Austria-Hungary had turned into the central thrust of the Eastern Front. And now, it demanded results he had not planned for. So Brusilov added a new goal, one he hoped might turn the tide of the entire war. If the Russian armies could capture the railway hub of Kovel, they could split the Austrian forces and push north toward Baranowicz, threatening the German heart of the Eastern Front. But things were no longer moving with ease. The Austrians had fallen back behind stronger positions. The Germans were arriving in greater numbers, and Brusilov's commanders were abandoning his methods. The meticulous coordination that defined the first phase of the offensive gave way to desperation. There was no time to rehearse assaults, no time to build sap trenches. Instead, mass attacks resumed the kind Russia had suffered from in years past. Wave after wave of infantry, with little cover, into machine gun fire. At Kovel and along the Stokhod River, Russian troops bled. Some divisions were decimated, and morale, once so high, began to erode. Brusilov pushed on, but even he began to understand the limits of momentum. Without proper logistics, without full support from the rest of the front, even genius could grind to a halt. Meanwhile, the long-awaited attack by General Everett finally launched on the 2nd of July. It was a disaster. Everett reverted to outdated Russian tactics. He advanced in dense waves across narrow sectors. He lost 80,000 men in a matter of days for nothing. Almost all of the ground he gained was retaken by the Germans within weeks. Brusilov was livid. Had another military man stood at the head of the Russian army as supreme commander, he later wrote, Everett would have been dismissed without delay, and Kuropatkin never would have found a place in the active army. But neither were punished. The Tsar, weak and unqualified, simply shifted attention elsewhere. The burdens remained on Brusilov. As the front dragged into August, Brusilov's tactical brilliance began to dissolve under pressure. With more sectors demanding support, fewer resources could be focused on key breakthroughs. His own commanders, exhausted and overwhelmed, reverted to simpler methods. The wide front strategy, so effective in June, was now a liability. German and Austro-Hungarian reinforcements stiffened defenses at every major point. The Russians, advancing farther from their railheads, began to suffer from supply shortages. One division after another hit a wall. And then came Romania. On the 27th of August, Romania entered the war on the side of the Entente. A long-awaited hope, but its timing was disastrous. Suddenly, Brusilov's southwestern front had to expand dramatically, covering the new Romanian frontier. Troops had to be diverted south. Reserves were stretched thinner still. There would be no final breakthrough at Kovel. No sweep through the Carpathians into Hungary. By October, the offensive faded into skirmishes. Rain, mud, and exhaustion choked the battlefields. The bloodletting slowed. But the scars would remain. By the time the Brusilov Offensive ground to a halt in autumn 1916, Russia had won its greatest military victory of the entire war. The Austro-Hungarian army had been mauled. 400,000 prisoners taken. Whole divisions vanished. The empire's southern flank exposed its morale in tatters. Konrad von Hötzendorf, the prideful architect of Austrian strategy, had been forced to beg Berlin for help. And he got it, but at a cost. Germany now assumed de facto control of Austria. Hungary's war effort, coordination, strategy, reinforcements, all now dictated from German general staff in Berlin. And so, ironically, Russia's greatest triumph may have tightened the Central Powers' grip. Some Russian officers saw it clearly. General Mikhail Belyaev wrote, "We have not yet begun to attack the German forces, putting things in their best light. We must still anticipate a very long and severe struggle." Brusilov himself had never intended for his offensive to be strategically decisive. That was Everett's job. Brusilov's task was to destroy men and morale, to shatter the enemy's fighting spirit. And in that, he had succeeded. But at what cost? Russian losses were staggering. Estimates vary wildly, but some suggest 1.5 million Russian casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, to inflict 850,000 on the enemy. Even for a victory, it was one of the bloodiest campaigns in modern history. As winter crept over the eastern plains, the snow covered more than trenches and bodies. It buried illusions. Illusions of victory, of momentum, of salvation. The Brusilov Offensive, hailed in its early days as a triumph, left Russia standing tall but swaying. The Tsarist regime presented it as proof that the Russian army had learned, had grown stronger. But underneath the surface, the rot remained. The innovation that fueled the offensive was not systemic, it was Brusilov's alone. And as soon as exhaustion and supply shortages took hold, even his army slipped back into the old habits. Disorder, bureaucracy, blood before brains. Worse still, the offensive did nothing to shift the center of gravity on the Eastern Front. The real threat to the Central Powers, the German army, remained largely unscathed. Historian David Stone would later argue that Brusilov, despite his brilliance, had no clear strategic goal. He ruptured the enemy's lines where it could be most easily affected, but these areas were of inferior strategic importance. The Austro-Hungarian losses were immense. But Austria-Hungary was not the key to German collapse. And by the end of the campaign, Germany had not only stabilized the front, it had assumed full command of it. Even worse, the casualties Russia suffered would never be replaced. Their army, especially the skilled veterans trained under Brusilov's reforms, was bleeding out. And, at home, discontent festered. The offensive had not masked the food shortages, nor had it quieted the demands for reform. The urban poor and war-weary peasants no longer believed the promises from Petrograd. They saw victories abroad, and hunger at home. And the Duma, Russia's parliament, was restless. It had been silenced during the campaign, but it had not been pacified. As the soldiers returned, wounded and disillusioned, their stories undermined the propaganda. They spoke of incompetence, of brutal commanders and pointless charges, of generals who had waited too long, of opportunities lost. In these whispers, in the letters, in the cafes, in the streets, the revolution was brewing. And yet, there remains the man, Alexei Brusilov, one of the few generals on any front who truly reinvented how wars were fought and not just how they were suffered. His offensive was studied in future wars by Soviets, by Germans, even by Western theorists. The concepts of dispersed attacks, flexible objectives, artillery observation, and depth infiltration all would echo into the next generation of warfare. The Wehrmachtsblitzkrieg? Its roots, however distant, can be traced through Brusilov's sap trenches and coordinated barrages. But there is a bitter irony. Brusilov's genius was too advanced for his own army. The Russian general staff, divided and aristocratic, never truly embraced his methods. When the offensive ended, many of his reforms died quietly in the mud. And worse, when the empire fell, Brusilov, loyal to Russia above all, served the new Bolshevik regime. He was one of the few Tsarist officers to do so. Some called him a traitor, others a pragmatist. But perhaps he was simply a man who had always fought for the nation, not for the dynasty. His final years were quiet. He died in 1926, largely forgotten in the West and only awkwardly remembered in Soviet Russia. But his offensive remains the deadliest success the Eastern Front ever saw. In the end, the Brusilov Offensive changed everything and changed nothing. It nearly destroyed the Austro-Hungarian army. It pulled dozens of German divisions east. It gave Russia one final moment of military glory. But it also drained the last strength of the Russian army and exposed the paralysis at the heart of its command. The Tsar's authority never recovered. The disillusionment spread like frost, and within a year, the empire that once hurled millions to the front lines would collapse from within. Brusilov had given the world a glimpse of what Russia could be: organized, innovative, effective, but his light burned too briefly. And so, as we look back, we are left with the question, was this offensive Russia's finest hour? Or its final illusion? Because sometimes, the greatest victories do not save empires. They only mark the beginning of their end.